Danger at Diablo, Chapter 13. Rango's Story. Rango's accusation against the sheriff started a wild clamor of excitement in the crowd. John Shanley did his best to look shocked and horrified. "My money? Gone?" He repeated it several times as if he couldn't believe it. Big Ben Crane, striding up to see what was causing the excited yelling, roared angrily when he found out. "I knew it! I've been warning you there was something crooked going on right under your noses!" He yelled at Lofty. "Don't stand around, Craig! Get up a posse!" Shanley stole a quick look at Annie. She wore a look of stunned amazement. He spoke quickly for her benefit. "No, wait. We haven't heard the whole story yet. Maybe there's some mistake." He turned to Rango. "Go on." "There's no mistake, Mr. Shanley," Rango snapped. "We'd gone about 6 miles on the old jump-off trail when a bullet smacked into a rock in front of my horse. It came from across the canyon. I pulled up quick. There was no place to hide, but I yelled to McTavish to wheel and head back. I could see somebody hiding in the rocks across the canyon. Couldn't tell if there was more than one, and I couldn't take a chance on a gunfight carrying your money." Someone in the crowd spoke. "Money?" John Shanley nodded, frowning. "He and McTavish were on a private errand for me," he explained hastily. "What happened next?" he barked at Rango. "Get to the point, man." "I'm doing the best I can," Rango groaned, nursing his wounded arm. Lofty brought him a drink of water, and after a moment Rango was able to go on. "Instead of turning like I expected, McTavish pulled his gun and shot at me, point blank. My horse was moving and it only got me in the arm. I reared my horse and drove at him. He ducked and clubbed me with the gun. That's all I remember till I woke up, stretched out on the trail and the money gone." "How much did he get away with?" Ben Crane was openly curious. Rango let Shanley answer. The land agent's voice shook with pretended indignation as he told Crane, loudly enough for everyone to hear, $20,000 in gold and currency, just about every cent I had in the bank." "20,000?" It was Crane again. The big man's voice boomed out. "What kind of errand did you send that much money on? Why didn't you send a draft?" "It had to be cash. Mr. Rango brought me a land deal that looked worth the chance." John Shanley sank down on the jail steps, fanning himself with his stovepipe hat and looking dejected. The crowd muttered sympathetically, more than one stealing a glance at Annie to see how she was taking this. She stood silent, her face white and drawn, looking from Rango to John Shanley. "I can't explain, folks, because it was a private deal," Shanley went on, "just between Mr. Rango and me." "How did Luke get in on it if it was so private?" It was the shrewd little owner of the general store, an old friend of the sheriff's. He was curious about the deal, and he was suspicious of the glib-tongued Rango on general principles. Annie noticed that several of the other men felt the same way, and she was heartened at the evidence that all Diablo wasn't ready to condemn her uncle on a stranger's wild story. "That," said Rango, "was his own idea, and we were fools enough to let him put it over." Shanley explained. "You see, when Mr. Rango and I agreed to go into this business deal, I was a little worried about sending that much cash without someone to guard it, so I suggested to Mr. Rango that we get Luke McTavish to suggest a reliable man to ride along with Mr. Rango as a bodyguard. He was agreeable, and I brought Luke over to my office to talk about it. I was a bit surprised when he said he'd take on the job himself." "I was, too," Rango chimed in, "but he was pretty smooth about it. He said nobody'd think anything about him riding out early in the morning that way, because they'd think he was trailing that horse thief that got out of jail so easy." "Yeah, some people might have thought so." Ben Crane cast a hard look at Lofty, who hadn't gotten over the shock of Rango's accusation and was standing silent and unhappy beside Annie. "But the rest of us have got our own ideas on how that horse thief was let go, and why." "Let go?" Lofty roared. "That does it!" He lashed out with his fist at Ben Crane. The older man was his equal in size and a tough fighter. Lofty's fist clipped him on the chin and staggered him for a second. Then, with an angry bellow, he waded in with both fists flying. The crowd, delighted at any kind of fight, gave way for the two men to battle in the middle of the street. Annie watched in worried silence as first one and then the other landed a blow. Fighting never settled anything, she thought, and wished unhappily that they would stop it. Rango and John Shanley watched in baffled anger as Lofty toppled Ben Crane with a wild rush, and the crowd roared gleefully and cheered the deputy. The two schemers exchanged quick glances. The fight was distracting Diablo's attention from the robbery story, and Lofty Craig was winning the crowd's approval at a time when Shanley wanted it to turn against both Luke and Lofty. Shanley stepped quickly toward the fighters who were rolling in the middle of the street, punching at each other. "Stop it!" he yelled. "Stop!" There was an angry growl of protest from the men who lined the wooden sidewalk. They resented Shanley's interference. But Shanley grabbed Lofty by the arm and tried to jerk him to his feet as the deputy was lifting his double fist to land a blow on Crane's jaw. An annoyed bystander on the sidewalk grabbed up a thick chunk of wood and aimed it at the back of Shanley's head. Annie saw the chunk starting to fly through the air. She jerked her gun from its holster and took split-second aim. Her bullet caught the heavy missile in midair and smashed it into splinters. The roar of the six-shooter put a quick end to the fight. Both Lofty and Ben Crane scrambled to their feet, grimy and exhausted, and looking around wildly, both reaching for their guns in a natural reaction to the shot. John Shanley had wheeled, his own hand going to the shoulder holster inside his long coat. His hand dropped quickly to his side as he saw Annie, smoking Colt in hand, grinning at him. The man who had flung the chunk of wood pushed his way hurriedly back into the crowd and disappeared before he could be grabbed. There were half a dozen who had seen what had happened, and they all tried to tell it at once, and to congratulate Annie on her quickness and skill with her six-shooter. "Good thing she saw him in time," one of them said. "Ma'am," said another, "you sure can't handle that there weapon of yours." And Shanley, with a great show of gratitude, thanked her and assured her that he wouldn't forget her alertness. "It seems as if I'm always having to say thank you to you, Annie." "It wasn't anything," she answered soberly. "I just happened to see him in time." "What are you going to do?" She swallowed hard. "About Uncle Luke?" "I'm afraid there's nothing we can do." He kept a note of regret in his voice. "Except to send a posse out to look for him and his gang." "I still think... I just know there must be some mistake." Her eyes were brimming, and she turned her head away so that Shanley wouldn't see her tears. "I can't believe Uncle Luke do anything wrong." "It's hard for me to believe, too." He shook his head sadly. "But I'm afraid the temptation was too much for him. $20,000 is a lot of money, Annie, and we don't know how deeply he's involved with those outlaws. Maybe Luke wants to be honest, but he's in too far." Annie was silent. She was still not convinced. There was nothing crooked about the man she and Tag had grown to love in the last few days they had been here, and nobody could make her think so. Shanley saw how she felt. He decided to build it up a little more. "There's more to it than just the story Rango told. When Luke offered to ride along with Rango and guard that money, he let slip to us that he was in a very bad way for money himself. I don't know what was going on. It sounded to me as if somebody might be blackmailing him. Naturally, I couldn't ask questions." "If you thought that, why did you let him go? Weren't you afraid he'd take your money after all the things people like Mr. Crane have said about him?" "No. He gave me a good reason for wanting to get to Jump Off." Annie's eyes were stormy. Shanley spoke quickly. "I'm going to tell you something I don't want anyone else in Diablo to know." "I won't say anything to anyone, Mr. Shanley." "I believe you, Annie. First, let me tell you that it wasn't a land deal Mr. Rango brought me. There's been a gold strike at Jump Off, and it's still a secret, even to most people up there. Rango gave me a chance to get in on it with him for that $20,000. Her eyes widened. He could see she believed him. Shanley went on briskly. "We hadn't intended to tell Luke what was in the air, but something slipped out, and right away he offered to ride along with Rango so that he could get in on the strike. He said he had some money owed to him at Jump Off, and if he could get his hands on it, he wanted to invest in a claim for you kids up there. I believed it. It never occurred to me he was planning to rob Rango and me, and not go anywhere near the gold strike." He watched Annie narrowly, and saw that she was uncertain and worried now. He had told her a good, believable story, and it had its effect. He shook his head sadly. "Well, what's done is done, and there's nothing we can do now but to try to find him and bring him back." Then he added sternly, "In the meantime, we must keep Mr. Rango's secret about the gold strike. Don't mention it to anyone, or you'll start a stampede to Jump Off, and it wouldn't be fair to Rango. He must have his chance to find other financing now that I can no longer spare any money to invest." Annie promised soberly not to tell anyone, even Tag. She felt miserable to think that Shanley had lost not only his $20,000, but also his chance to make many times that much buying and selling the claims. Lofty and Ben Crane were still growling at each other as the posse of 5 men was being organized. Crane was openly against letting Lofty go with the posse. "He's McTavish's deputy," he declared, "and his friend. How do we know he won't destroy any trail McTavish has left and keep us from tracking him down?" Lofty, on his part, loudly refused to believe any part of the story told by the stranger, Rango. He declared that when the truth came out, it would be discovered that it was all a plot to discredit and possibly kill the innocent sheriff, and that Ben Crane would be found to be mixed up in it somewhere. Lofty's theory was hooted at by some and mildly supported by others, but there was a general feeling of wait and see around Diablo, with an undercurrent of curiosity as to what the $20,000 had been meant for, and an equally strong undercurrent of sympathy for Annie Oakley and her little brother, who had come a long way only to get a crushing blow like this. Doc Busby finished bandaging the slight wound in Rango's arm and pronounced it the least scratch he had ever worked on. He peered over his glasses at the sharp-featured young patient and pulled at his mustache thoughtfully. "Always thought Luke McTavish was a better shot than that. Seems funny he missed at such a close range." Rango glared at him. "Meaning you wished he hadn't, hey, Sawbones? Too bad to disappoint you." And then he stalked over to where Annie and John Shanley stood apart. Doc Busby looked over his specs after the rangy gunman and shook his head. He told himself, "That is a nasty-tempered man, Busby. I don't think I like him." Rango strode up to Shanley and Annie. "Looks like we got our posse. You going along, Mr. Shanley?" "I hadn't planned to," Shanley answered. "I'm going." Annie turned to hurry toward Target. Rango disagreed abruptly. She stopped and looked coldly at him. "We'll be moving too fast to bother with taking a girl along." Annie's eyes flashed. "You don't have much to say about it, Mr. Rango. It's my uncle you're looking for, and I aim to be close by when you find him. It's a good story you tell about what happened to Mr. Shanley's money, but that doesn't mean it's true. $20,000 could have looked just as big to you as you claim it did to my uncle." Rango glared. "If you weren't only a puny female—" He doubled his fist suggestively. Annie smiled her contempt and held her ground. Lofty had already started over to see what was going on when Rango's fist dropped to his side and he turned away abruptly. "Better get started," Shanley advised hastily. Rango stalked to his horse and hauled it around roughly as he mounted. Annie watched him with a frown. When she turned to Shanley, he shook his head regretfully. "I suppose if you want to ride along with the posse, Annie, it'll be all right, but some of the outlaws might still be around." "I'll have to see them before I believe Mr. Rango's story," she retorted, and ran to mount her cow-pony. Shanley was worried. He had had no chance to talk to Rango privately to find out what had really happened out at the ambush. Now the posse would be snooping around out there, and unless Rango had been careful to destroy any evidence against his story, Annie's sharp eyes might turn up something to betray him. He decided suddenly that he would ride along with the posse. If Annie got suspicious, he might be able to talk her out of it, somehow. "Wait," he called, hurrying toward the group of riders as they got ready to move up the street. "I'll go with you."